Before anyone in the studio could react, the conversation suddenly took a sharp turn no one expected. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? When a question that initially sounds ordinary begins to shift the tone of an entire panel discussion. Moments like that are part of what makes daytime talk shows so compelling to watch, especially when the conversation involves strong personalities and a topic that clearly matters to the guests sitting at the table. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. On this particular episode, the discussion began much the way many segments on daytime television do. The hosts of the show were seated around the familiar table, moving through the morning's lineup of conversations. The studio audience had already warmed up to the rhythm of the program, laughing at a few light moments earlier in the broadcast and applauding as the next guest was introduced. Simu Liu walked onto the set to a welcoming round of applause from the audience. For viewers at home, the introduction felt upbeat and friendly, the way most celebrity interviews on daytime talk shows start. The hosts greeted him with smiles, and the atmosphere in the studio appeared relaxed. The early part of the conversation focused on his recent projects and the growing recognition he had received in Hollywood. As many viewers would expect, the hosts began by asking about his acting career and the opportunities that had opened up for him in recent years. Simu answered comfortably, leaning slightly forward at the table as he spoke, clearly familiar with this type of interview setting. The tone at first was casual and conversational. The panel laughed together a few times as he shared small behind-the-scenes details about filming and about the unexpected ways his life had changed since becoming widely known. Audience members nodded and applauded at several points, especially when he mentioned the importance of representation in entertainment. That topic, representation, naturally led the conversation toward broader discussions about Hollywood and the changing landscape of film and television. It was the kind of subject that often appears on daytime talk shows, serious enough to matter, but still accessible for a wide audience. The hosts took turns asking questions, each bringing a slightly different perspective. One asked about how audiences around the world had responded to his work. Another mentioned how young viewers might see his success as something inspiring. Simu responded thoughtfully, choosing his words carefully, often pausing for a moment before answering. For several minutes, the segment continued smoothly. But as the discussion shifted toward the way actors speak about cultural identity and industry expectations, the conversation slowly began to change in tone. This wasn't immediately obvious to viewers, but those watching closely might have noticed subtle shifts in body language around the table. Joy Behar leaned slightly towards Simu as she prepared to ask her next question. Her style on the panel has always been direct, and longtime viewers know that she often brings a more pointed approach when discussing social topics. Her question started calmly enough. She referenced comments Simu had made in previous interviews about representation and responsibility in the entertainment industry. Then she asked whether actors sometimes feel pressure to speak on behalf of entire communities once they become well known. At first, the question seemed like a natural continuation of the conversation. The audience remained quiet, listening closely as Simu considered how to respond. He nodded slightly before speaking, acknowledging that the topic was complicated. He explained that while visibility can create opportunities to highlight important issues, it can also place a lot of expectations on individuals who are simply doing their jobs as performers. The response was measured and thoughtful, and for a moment the discussion appeared to settle back into a comfortable rhythm. But Joy followed up with a more pointed remark. She suggested that sometimes public figures emphasize representation in ways that might make audiences feel lectured or pressured, especially when entertainment is supposed to be a form of escape. Her tone wasn't confrontational, but it was noticeably firmer than the earlier questions. At that point, viewers could sense a small shift in the room. Simu paused again before answering, and the brief silence was noticeable enough that a few audience members shifted in their seats. The other hosts around the table glanced between the two speakers, clearly aware that the conversation had moved into more sensitive territory. When Simu finally responded, his tone remained calm, but there was a clear sense that he wanted to clarify his position. He explained that for many performers, talking about representation isn't about lecturing audiences. Instead, he said, it's often about acknowledging experiences that have historically been overlooked. His voice stayed even, but his posture became a little more upright, signaling that he was now speaking more deliberately. Joy listened closely, but she quickly added another comment, suggesting that audiences sometimes prefer stories to stand on their own without broader cultural discussions attached to them. That was the moment when Simu gently pushed back. He didn't raise his voice or interrupt, but he leaned slightly forward and responded directly to her point. He explained that storytelling and cultural context often go hand in hand, especially for communities that have spent decades trying to see themselves represented accurately on screen. The tone of the conversation remained respectful, but the tension was now noticeable. One of the other hosts briefly stepped in with a small remark, attempting to broaden the discussion and keep the panel balanced. The studio audience reacted with a few scattered claps, perhaps sensing that the exchange had become more serious than a typical celebrity interview. Simu continued speaking calmly, emphasizing that conversations about representation are not meant to diminish anyone else's experience with entertainment. Instead, he described them as part of a larger cultural conversation that many people find meaningful. Joy listened carefully, occasionally nodding, but she still appeared ready to challenge parts of his perspective. From a viewer's perspective, this was the point when the interview shifted from a standard promotional appearance into something more substantial. The discussion had clearly become a genuine exchange of viewpoints, the kind that sometimes unfolds naturally on live television when hosts and guests engage directly with each other's ideas. The audience in the studio remained attentive. Some members leaned forward slightly, following the conversation closely, while others looked toward the hosts to see how the moment would develop. What made the exchange particularly interesting was that neither side appeared interested in turning the moment into an argument. Instead, the discussion felt like two different perspectives being expressed openly, something daytime talk shows often aim for but don't always achieve in such a clear way. Still, the conversation wasn't finished evolving. Joy began preparing another follow-up question, one that would move the discussion even deeper into the topic that had just sparked the first moment of tension. And as viewers at home watched the panel navigate this unexpected turn in the conversation, it became clear that the interview was no longer just about promoting a film or discussing a career. It had become something else entirely, a live discussion about culture, expectations, and the role public figures play in shaping those conversations. And the way Simu Liu responded to the next question would determine whether the moment remained a thoughtful exchange, or became something more intense for everyone watching live. As the discussion continued, the atmosphere in the studio remained attentive, but noticeably more focused than it had been earlier in the segment. Conversations like this sometimes develop gradually on live television, where a topic that begins as casual commentary slowly turns into a deeper exchange of viewpoints. That was clearly happening now. Simu Liu remained composed as he sat at the table, his hands resting lightly in front of him as he listened to the panel. He appeared calm, but viewers could tell he was paying close attention to every word being said. The earlier moment of pushback had shifted the rhythm of the interview, and the hosts seemed aware that they were now in the middle of a more serious conversation. Across the table, Joy Behar leaned slightly forward again, preparing to continue the line of questioning she had started. Her tone remained conversational, but the way she framed her next comment made it clear she wanted to explore the issue further. She began by acknowledging Simu's earlier point about representation and visibility in entertainment. Then she added that some viewers might feel overwhelmed when actors or filmmakers bring social discussions into promotional interviews or press appearances. From her perspective, she explained, audiences sometimes tune in simply wanting to hear about the creative work itself. The way she said it wasn't confrontational, but it carried a directness that many longtime viewers recognize as part of her style. Around the table, the other hosts watched closely, allowing Simu space to respond. Simu nodded once as Joy finished speaking. Before answering, he paused for a moment, almost as if organizing his thoughts carefully. That pause itself became noticeable. In the quiet of the studio, even small moments like that can signal that a response is being considered thoughtfully rather than delivered automatically. When he began speaking again, his voice remained steady. He explained that he understood the point Joy was making. Entertainment, he said, is something people turn to for many reasons, sometimes to relax, sometimes to connect with a story, and sometimes simply to enjoy a performance. But he also added that for many performers, especially those from communities that haven't always been widely represented in media, the opportunity to speak about those experiences feels meaningful. His explanation was measured, and he made an effort to keep the conversation balanced rather than defensive. From the perspective of viewers watching the broadcast, it was clear he wasn't rejecting Joy's comment outright. Instead, he was reframing it, explaining why discussions about representation can appear frequently in interviews without necessarily being intended as statements directed at audiences. One of the other hosts briefly stepped in at that point, noting that conversations about representation had become more common in the industry over the past several years. Her remark seemed designed to widen the discussion slightly and keep the exchange from becoming too narrowly focused between two people. The audience responded with a few supportive claps, which briefly lightened the atmosphere. But Joy wasn't quite finished with her point. She leaned back slightly in her chair before continuing. This time, her comment shifted the focus toward how public conversations about identity sometimes intersect with expectations placed on actors themselves. She asked Simu whether he ever felt that people expect him to speak on behalf of an entire community, simply because he has achieved a visible level of success. The question was delivered calmly, but it carried an underlying challenge. Viewers could sense that she was asking him to address something that many public figures encounter: the balance between personal identity and public responsibility. Simu nodded again, acknowledging the complexity of the question. He explained that while he values the ability to talk about issues that matter to him, he doesn't see himself as representing every individual experience within a community. Instead, he described his perspective as just one voice among many. As he spoke, his tone remained calm but slightly more deliberate than earlier in the interview. His posture had shifted subtly as well. He sat upright, occasionally gesturing with one hand to emphasize certain points, something viewers often notice when guests move from casual conversation into more thoughtful explanation. Joy listened carefully, but as soon as he finished, she responded with another observation. She suggested that sometimes the conversation around representation can become so central in media coverage that audiences begin to associate actors primarily with those discussions rather than their performances. That remark prompted a small reaction from the audience, not loud, but enough to signal that the room recognized the conversation had become more pointed. Simu didn't react immediately. Instead, he allowed the moment to settle before responding. When he did speak, the shift in tone was subtle but noticeable. He acknowledged that media coverage can sometimes frame stories in ways that emphasize certain themes more than others. But he added that actors themselves often don't control how those narratives develop once interviews and headlines begin circulating. That comment appeared to resonate with several audience members, who nodded and applauded lightly. Joy smiled slightly, though she still seemed ready to challenge aspects of the discussion. Her expression suggested she was engaged rather than frustrated, which helped keep the overall tone of the exchange respectful even as the disagreement became clearer. At that moment, another host gently attempted to steer the conversation toward the creative side of Simu's work, asking about how storytelling choices influence the way characters are portrayed on screen. The shift offered a brief reset for the segment. Simu responded enthusiastically to that question, describing how writers, directors, and actors collaborate to create characters that feel authentic. As he spoke about the process of bringing stories to life, the energy in the room softened slightly. For a few minutes, the panel returned to discussing filmmaking, performance, and the challenges of balancing artistic vision with audience expectations. But even during that portion of the conversation, the earlier exchange lingered in the background. Viewers could sense that the subject of representation and public conversation hadn't fully resolved itself. And eventually, the discussion circled back. Joy once again referenced the earlier topic, this time bringing up how viewers at home sometimes react strongly to conversations about identity in entertainment. She mentioned that talk shows themselves receive messages and comments from audiences who feel very differently about the subject. Her point seemed aimed at highlighting the variety of perspectives among viewers. Simu listened closely, and when he responded, his tone remained calm but slightly firmer than before. He explained that disagreement is a natural part of public discussion. In his view, conversations about culture and storytelling are healthiest when people feel comfortable expressing different perspectives respectfully. That comment drew another round of applause from the audience. From the perspective of someone watching the broadcast, it was clear that the moment had evolved into something more thoughtful than tense. Both sides were continuing to express their views, but neither appeared interested in turning the exchange into a confrontation. Still, the conversation had clearly moved far beyond the light promotional interview that the segment had started as. And as the panel prepared to continue the discussion, viewers could sense that the next part of the conversation might push the topic even further, particularly if Joy chose to ask the follow-up question she seemed to be considering. Because by now, everyone in the room understood that the discussion wasn't just about entertainment anymore. It had become a wider conversation about how public figures, media platforms, and audiences all interact when cultural issues enter the spotlight on live television. By this point in the conversation, viewers watching the broadcast could clearly sense that the interview had settled into a more serious rhythm. The energy around the table remained respectful, But the discussion had moved well beyond the casual tone that often defines celebrity segments on daytime television. Simu Liu continued to listen carefully to each comment from the panel, occasionally nodding as the host spoke. His responses remained thoughtful and measured, and he appeared focused on explaining his perspective rather than turning the conversation into a debate. Across the table, Joy Behar seemed equally engaged. She had shifted slightly in her chair, her hands resting on the table as she followed the discussion closely. Her expression suggested curiosity as much as skepticism, the kind of posture she often adopts when she believes a topic deserves a deeper examination. The exchange had already touched on several themes: representation, audience expectations, and the role actors play in cultural conversations. But as the discussion moved forward, Joy introduced another angle that subtly raised the stakes of the conversation. She began by referencing how entertainment media has changed over the past decade, particularly in terms of the kinds of stories that receive attention and the way those stories are discussed publicly. Her comment suggested that audiences today are often asked to think about social context alongside entertainment in ways that weren't always part of earlier media coverage. The remark itself wasn't controversial, but the way she framed it led directly into another question for Simu. She asked whether actors sometimes feel pressure from studios, media outlets, or audiences to address cultural topics during interviews, even when they might prefer to focus purely on their creative work. It was a question that carried a slightly different tone than the earlier ones. Rather than focusing only on representation itself, it suggested the possibility that public conversations might sometimes be shaped by expectations outside the performer's control. Simu listened carefully before answering. As he did earlier, he paused briefly before speaking, a habit that had become noticeable throughout the segment. When he began responding, his voice remained calm, but there was a new level of clarity in his explanation. He said that conversations about culture and identity don't always originate from external pressure. In many cases, he explained, they come from the personal experiences of the actors themselves. He noted that when someone spends years working in an industry where certain perspectives have historically been underrepresented, it's natural to want to talk about that experience once the opportunity arises. Several audience members nodded in agreement, and a few offered a short round of applause. Joy listened attentively, though she didn't immediately respond. Instead, another host briefly entered the conversation, adding that viewers at home sometimes appreciate hearing those perspectives because it helps them understand the broader context behind the stories they watch. That comment appeared to ease the atmosphere slightly, giving the discussion a more balanced tone. But Joy soon followed up again, this time framing her point from the perspective of viewers who might feel disconnected from those conversations. She explained that some audience members write to the show expressing the feeling that entertainment interviews occasionally become too focused on social themes. In their view, she said, they simply want to enjoy films and performances without feeling like they're being drawn into larger debates. The remark wasn't delivered harshly, but it introduced a tension that viewers could clearly feel in the room. Simu responded by acknowledging that audiences approach entertainment in many different ways. Some viewers focus purely on the story, while others are interested in the deeper context behind it. But he gently pushed back on the idea that discussing those themes necessarily interferes with enjoyment. He explained that storytelling has always reflected cultural experiences. Even when audiences don't consciously think about it, many films and television shows draw from real social dynamics and historical influences. As he spoke, he gestured lightly with his hands, emphasizing certain points while maintaining an even tone. The audience responded positively, with several people applauding as he finished. Joy smiled slightly, but she appeared ready to continue the conversation. She pointed out that daytime talk shows themselves often become places where these broader discussions unfold. In her view, part of the role of a program like this is to give space to multiple viewpoints, even when those viewpoints occasionally differ. Simu agreed with that idea. He said that conversations like the one they were having can be valuable precisely because they allow people to hear perspectives they might not normally encounter. The exchange remained calm, but viewers watching closely could tell that both participants were standing firmly behind their viewpoints. At that moment, one of the other hosts attempted to bring the conversation back towards Simu's current projects, mentioning the growing popularity of his recent work and the response from audiences worldwide. The shift offered another brief moment of lighter conversation. Simu smiled as he described some of the reactions he had received from fans, including messages from viewers who said they felt inspired by seeing characters who reflected their own experiences. The audience responded warmly, applauding again. But the earlier topic still lingered just beneath the surface of the conversation. And soon enough, Joy returned to it once more, this time focusing on the idea of balance. She asked Simu whether he ever worries that conversations about representation could overshadow the creative aspects of filmmaking, the performances, the writing, the visual storytelling that audiences ultimately come to see. It was a fair question, and the way she asked it suggested she was genuinely interested in hearing his perspective. Simu leaned slightly forward before answering. He explained that he doesn't see those elements as competing with each other. In his view, storytelling and cultural context are often interconnected. He said that when audiences connect with a character or story, they are often responding not only to the entertainment value but also to the authenticity behind it. That authenticity, he explained, sometimes includes acknowledging the cultural backgrounds and experiences that shape the story. The explanation resonated with several audience members, and another round of applause followed. At this point, the conversation had become something that viewers at home likely recognized as one of those unscripted talk show moments where a guest and host explore a topic more deeply than originally planned. No one raised their voice, and the tone remained respectful. But there was a clear sense that both Simu and Joy were determined to explain their viewpoints fully. For the other hosts on the panel, the challenge now was maintaining the flow of the show while allowing the exchange to remain productive. One of them briefly summarized what had been discussed so far, noting that the conversation highlighted the different ways audiences and performers think about storytelling today. The summary seemed to help reset the tone again, giving the panel a moment to breathe before moving forward. But as viewers continued watching, it was clear that the exchange between Simu Liu and Joy Behar had already become the defining moment of the segment. And with several minutes still remaining in the discussion, there was every indication that the conversation might continue evolving before the segment finally came to an end. By the time the conversation reached this stage of the segment, the energy in the studio had settled into something that felt thoughtful rather than tense. What had started as a routine celebrity interview had clearly developed into a broader discussion about storytelling, audience expectations, and the role public figures sometimes play in cultural conversations. Simu Liu remained composed at the table, listening closely as the panel continued to explore the topic from different angles. His responses had stayed calm and measured throughout the segment, and viewers could see that he was making a deliberate effort to keep the discussion respectful while still expressing his point of view clearly. Across the table, Joy Behar appeared equally engaged. Her posture had relaxed slightly compared with earlier moments, though she continued to lean forward occasionally when making a point. For longtime viewers of the program, this kind of exchange was familiar. The show often encourages open discussions between guests and hosts, and sometimes those conversations naturally move into deeper territory. One of the other hosts stepped in briefly to reflect on the discussion so far. She mentioned that audiences today consume entertainment in many different ways, and that viewers often bring their own personal experiences into how they interpret films and television shows. Her comments seemed to broaden the discussion again, giving both Simu and Joy a moment to pause before continuing. The audience responded with a light round of applause, and the atmosphere in the studio felt steady and attentive. Joy then returned to the conversation with another observation, though this time her tone sounded slightly more reflective than before. She acknowledged that storytelling has always reflected the social environment in which it is created. Films from earlier decades often contained themes tied to the issues of their time, even if audiences didn't always recognize those connections immediately. Her point suggested that perhaps the difference today lies in how openly those themes are discussed during interviews and promotional appearances. Simu nodded as she spoke, indicating that he understood the perspective she was presenting. When he responded, he continued in the same calm tone he had used throughout the interview. He explained that many actors today feel comfortable discussing their experiences because audiences themselves have become more interested in hearing about the context behind stories. In his view, conversations about identity or representation aren't separate from storytelling. They are often part of how stories are understood and appreciated. As he spoke, he briefly described how fans sometimes approach him after screenings or events, sharing personal stories about how certain characters or moments in films resonated with them. Those experiences, he said, often remind him that entertainment can have an impact beyond simply providing an enjoyable viewing experience. Several audience members responded with nods and quiet applause. Joy listened carefully before offering another thought. She pointed out that one of the challenges for talk shows is finding the right balance between entertainment and deeper discussion. Programs like this one, she explained, aim to keep conversations engaging for a wide range of viewers. Some people tune in looking for light conversation and humor, while others appreciate moments when guests speak more seriously about topics that matter to them. Her remarks seemed less like a challenge and more like an acknowledgement of the balancing act that live television sometimes requires. Simu agreed with that point. He said that appearing on a talk show often means adjusting to the rhythm of the conversation as it unfolds. Sometimes the discussion stays light and focused on upcoming projects, while other times it naturally moves toward broader subjects depending on the questions being asked. He added that moments like the one they were having can actually be valuable because they allow people to hear different perspectives in a calm and respectful setting. That comment drew another brief round of applause from the audience. At this stage of the segment, the earlier tension had softened considerably. Viewers watching at home could likely see that the exchange between Simu and Joy had evolved into a genuine conversation rather than a disagreement. One of the other hosts took the opportunity to ask Simu about how he approaches choosing roles, especially as his career continues to grow. The question shifted the discussion back toward filmmaking, offering a natural transition away from the earlier debate. Simu smiled slightly as he answered, explaining that he looks for projects where the story feels meaningful and the characters feel authentic. Sometimes that authenticity comes from the emotional journey of the character, while other times it comes from the cultural background of the story. In either case, he said, the goal is always to connect with audiences in a genuine way. The audience responded warmly, applauding again as he finished speaking. Joy added a brief comment acknowledging that many actors hope their work connects with viewers on multiple levels. Even when people simply enjoy the film itself, there are often deeper elements within the story that give it lasting impact. The exchange felt noticeably lighter now than it had earlier in the segment. For viewers watching live, the conversation seemed to be finding a natural resolution. Both sides had expressed their viewpoints clearly, and the tone had remained respectful throughout. Another host then mentioned how discussions like this sometimes continue long after a show airs, particularly on social media where viewers share their reactions and interpretations. That remark drew a few laughs from the audience, since many people are familiar with how quickly talk show moments can spread online. Simu acknowledged that reality as well. He said that once a conversation takes place on live television, viewers often interpret it in many different ways. Some people focus on one comment, while others focus on the broader message behind the exchange. In his opinion, that diversity of reactions simply reflects how audiences engage with media today. Joy nodded in agreement, adding that talk shows themselves have always been places where different perspectives come together. Even when people disagree, the goal is usually to keep the discussion respectful and informative. The audience responded with another small round of applause, recognizing that the panel had navigated the conversation thoughtfully. As the segment moved closer to its final minutes, the hosts began guiding the conversation toward wrapping up the discussion. The shift was subtle but noticeable to viewers who follow the pacing of live television. Simu shared a few final reflections about storytelling and the importance of continuing conversations about representation in a way that encourages understanding rather than division. His tone remained calm and sincere, and it was clear that he wanted the overall message of the segment to be constructive. The hosts listened attentively, and several nodded as he finished speaking. At that point, viewers watching at home could sense that the conversation had reached a natural closing point. But before the segment ended, there was still one final moment that would shape how audiences remembered the discussion after the broadcast was over. Because what happened in the final exchange, and how the audience reacted, would determine how the entire conversation was interpreted once the episode aired and viewers began sharing their thoughts online. As the segment moved into its final minutes, the overall tone around the table felt noticeably calmer than it had earlier in the discussion. What had begun as a routine promotional interview had gradually evolved into a thoughtful exchange about storytelling, cultural context, and the way audiences engage with entertainment today. For viewers watching the broadcast, it was one of those moments that daytime talk shows sometimes produce unexpectedly, a conversation that grows deeper simply because the participants are willing to speak openly and listen carefully to one another. Simu Liu sat back slightly in his chair as the conversation began to wind down. His posture appeared relaxed again, and the intensity that had briefly surfaced earlier in the segment had given way to a more reflective mood. Across the table, Joy Behar also seemed comfortable as the panel prepared to close the discussion. Her earlier questions had clearly pushed the conversation into deeper territory, but by this point both she and Simu had acknowledged each other's perspectives in a way that kept the tone respectful. One of the other hosts briefly summarized what had unfolded during the segment. She pointed out that the conversation had touched on several themes that audiences often debate, the role of representation in entertainment, the expectations placed on actors, and the different ways viewers interpret stories. Her summary seemed designed to help viewers at home understand the broader context of the exchange, especially those who might have tuned in midway through the interview. The studio audience responded with a warm round of applause. Simu then offered a few closing thoughts of his own. Speaking calmly, he explained that conversations like the one they had just shared can actually be valuable because they allow people to hear perspectives that might not always appear in typical promotional interviews. He added that storytelling has always been shaped by the experiences of the people who create it, and that discussing those experiences openly can help audiences connect with stories in meaningful ways. His final remarks were thoughtful but concise, reflecting the kind of measured tone he had maintained throughout the entire discussion. The audience applauded again, and several members could be seen nodding in agreement. Joy responded with a brief comment acknowledging that talk shows exist partly to host exactly these kinds of conversations. In her view, part of the responsibility of a panel discussion is to allow guests and hosts to explore ideas together, even when they approach those ideas from slightly different angles. Her tone sounded appreciative rather than argumentative, and viewers could see that the earlier tension had largely faded. At that moment, another host shifted the conversation slightly toward lighter territory, thanking Simu for joining the show and mentioning his current projects once more. The remark served as a natural transition back into the familiar rhythm that usually closes celebrity interviews on daytime programs. Simu smiled and thanked the panel for the opportunity to talk, adding that he appreciated being able to have an honest conversation rather than simply repeating the same promotional talking points. That comment drew a small laugh from both the hosts and the audience. As the segment wrapped up, the host responsible for guiding the show's pacing reminded viewers that discussions like this are part of what keeps daytime talk shows engaging. Some interviews remain light and humorous, while others occasionally turn into deeper conversations that reflect broader cultural topics. The audience applauded once more as the camera slowly pulled back from the table. For viewers watching at home, the moment likely felt like one of those exchanges that lingers in memory after the episode ends. Nothing about the conversation had been overly dramatic, but it had clearly been genuine. And as often happens with live television, the discussion didn't end when the cameras moved on to the next segment. Within hours of the episode airing, clips from the conversation began appearing across social media platforms. Viewers shared short excerpts from the exchange between Simu and Joy, often highlighting the moment when Simu calmly explained his perspective on representation in storytelling. Some viewers praised his thoughtful responses and the way he addressed the topic without raising the temperature of the conversation. Others commented on how the panel allowed space for different viewpoints to be expressed respectfully. There were also viewers who appreciated Joy's questions, noting that talk shows work best when hosts are willing to challenge guests and ask questions that encourage deeper discussion. In many ways, the range of reactions reflected exactly what had taken place on the show itself, a conversation where multiple perspectives existed side by side. Entertainment commentators and television bloggers soon began discussing the segment as well. Several pointed out that moments like this often resonate with audiences because they feel unscripted and authentic. Rather than following a perfectly planned promotional format, the discussion had developed naturally as the participants responded to each other in real time. Later that day, some members of the show's production team mentioned the segment during online interviews and social media posts. They noted that conversations about storytelling and cultural context frequently appear on talk shows, especially when guests have strong viewpoints they are willing to explain thoughtfully. In this case, they said, the exchange between Simu and Joy reflected the kind of respectful disagreement that live television sometimes produces. Simu himself later addressed the discussion briefly during another interview. He explained that he appreciated the opportunity to talk openly about issues that matter to him, and he emphasized that he believes conversations like these can help audiences better understand the perspectives behind the stories they see on screen. His comments reinforced the calm and balanced tone he had maintained during the broadcast itself. Joy also referenced the segment during a later episode of the show, mentioning that lively discussions are part of what keeps the program engaging for viewers. She reiterated that the goal of the panel is always to explore different viewpoints while maintaining respect for the guest and for the audience. The studio audience had responded positively at the end of the segment, and that reaction seemed to carry over into the broader conversation that followed online. In the end, what stood out most about the exchange was not conflict, but the way both participants handled a potentially sensitive topic with composure and clarity. For viewers who had tuned in expecting a routine interview, the segment offered something slightly different, a real conversation unfolding live on television. And moments like that are often the ones that audiences remember long after the episode ends. If you watch the discussion between Simu Liu and Joy Behar, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.